Welcome to the Deathcast.
August 6th, 1966. Two men, Kenneth McDuff and his friend, Dale Greene, cruised the streets of Everman, Texas. They had spent the day pouring concrete for McDuff's father, and after getting off work, had decided to hang out. McDuff had convinced Greene to accompany him, as he said he was looking for a girl. At around 10 p.m., McDuff noticed a Ford pulled onto a baseball field with three teens standing outside of it. Robert Brand, age 17, Edna Louise Sullivan, age 16, and Brand's 15-year-old cousin, Mark Dunnman. McDuff, a cruel-faced young man with jet black hair, parked roughly 150 yards from the teen's car before pulling a .38 out and exiting. Brandishing the gun, McDuff approached the teens, threatening to shoot them if they did not do as he said. He ordered the teens into the Ford's trunk before instructing Greene to follow along in McDuff's Dodge Cornet. They drove along a stretch of highway for a short distance before McDuff pulled the Ford off into a field. He pulled Edna Louise Sullivan from the Ford's trunk and instructed Greene to place her inside of his own car. When Greene asked what he was going to do with the other teens, McDuff stated he would have to get rid of them. Robert Brand and Mark Dunnman pleaded with the man not to kill them. Their cries fell on deaf ears, as McDuff proceeded to fire 5 to 6 shots into the trunk, killing them both. He then instructed Greene to wipe down the Ford for any fingerprints, after which the two men, with their 16-year-old captive, continued driving. What happened next would go down in Texas history as the Broomstick Murders. Hello again, and welcome to the Deathcast. I am your host, best-selling independent author Ian Cotton, and I'd like to thank you for joining me today as we take a look at Kenneth McDuff, a serial killer from Texas, also known as the Broomstick Murderer. Before we get into the case, however, I've got my normal plugs. If you would like to follow me on social media, I can be found on Twitter at AuthorTotten. You can also find me on Instagram at IanTottenAuthor. I am on Facebook at Ian Totten Author. There is a Deathcast group associated with that page. You go there, you can see a little tab that says groups. Click on that and it'll take you to the page, and then I will confirm your request. If you would like to help support the show financially, you can find me on Patreon at Ian Totten Author. There are a few different tiers on there, and I will be putting up content very shortly concerning those tiers. You can also find me on Venmo and PayPal if you would like to make a one-time donation. This goes towards helping with the production of this show. A couple other ways you can help the show if you enjoy what it is I do. Leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app really helps this show, as the more 5-star reviews a show has, the higher up there in their algorithms it will appear. You can also purchase my books off of Amazon, Barnes & Noble, pretty much anywhere you can find books. You just put in Ian Totten. I have 5 out currently. The Blood Gods trilogy, which is a dark fantasy sci-fi horror series. The House of Silver Doors, which is a pretty straightforward Stephen King-esque horror tale about a haunted house. And then my newest book, which came out almost exactly a year ago, right around the time I'm recording this, in March, which is The Throwaway Girls of Olympia. That's a crime suspense novel in the vein of Dirty Harry from the 1970s. It's a tale about a small-time sheriff teaming up with a rookie FBI agent to try and hunt a serial killer who is preying on young women in the sheriff's town of Olympia, Nebraska. A quick note for listeners of the show. This is the final show for Season 1 of the Deathcast. I will be taking a couple weeks off to research other cases as well as tackle other projects I have going on, such as trying to finish the novel I am currently working on. But don't worry, the show will be back, and in the interim, I will be adding material up on the Patreon. That being said, get yourself something to drink, sit back in a chair, relax, close your eyes. I've got my coffee, I've got my cigarettes. Let's go into the crypt. Alright, so as you heard in the preview for the show, this story takes place in Texas, and Kenneth McDuff is an anomaly in the serial killer world, as he was put on death row twice, actually. And I'm going to get into that in just a minute. We're going to go through McDuff's early life before then. Kenneth Allen McDuff was born March 21st, 1946 in Rosebud, Texas. He was the fifth of 6 children born to John Allen J.A. McDuff and his wife, Addie. John Allen ran a concrete business, and the family, well, not being the most popular family in Rosebud, were fairly well-to-do. Numerous people have come forward in later years stating that the family was fairly weird. Despite this, the entire family attended the Assembly of God Church. From all that I could find, they were fairly regular attendees of the congregation. McDuff's family really seemed to favor all of their children. And as I said, his father was a fairly successful concrete worker, and as a result, they catered to their children's whims. Particularly Addie, she seems to have doted over her children. That would be 4 sons and 2 daughters. In addition to watching over the children and maintaining the family's finances, she also operated a washateria across the street from the house. And as a consequence of this, all of the children had a very strong work ethic instilled to them. One particularly interesting fact that I found was that Ken's mother, as well as his 3 oldest sisters, lavished him with attention and basically treated him as though he were a young god. And I'm taking that directly from an article from Texas Monthly. Ken could really do no wrong in his family's eyes. And by this I mean the rules that his parents had set down for the other children generally did not apply to Ken. He got away with things with impunity. This attention that was paid to him extended far beyond, treating him better than the others. Students that remembered McDuff said he almost always had new clothing and money in his pocket. And Addie even went so far as to purchase the young man a motorcycle at one point. And despite the fact that Ken oftentimes got into some trouble at the period in time before the murders took place, the real troublemaker in the family was his older brother, Lonnie, who at one point pulled a knife on another student in school and was thrown down a flight of steps for his trouble, and at another point was thrown off of a bus by the bus driver, at which point Addie promptly approached the bus and pulled a gun on the man, threatening to shoot him if she did not allow her son back onto the bus. This earned Addie the nickname among the other students as the pistol-packing mama. Apparently, this was a moniker that she seemed to enjoy. Regarding Ken, he was never required to assume responsibility for his actions, so much so that when he eventually did begin getting in trouble in school, his parents would blame the school themselves as opposed to, making their son take consequences for his actions. When Ken would get into trouble at school, it was not an unusual sight for Addie to show up at the school, oftentimes carrying the gun that she had threatened the bus driver with, to take care of the situation. One teacher at the high school where Ken attended even has gone on the record as saying that the teachers at the school were terrified of Addie McDuff. And in reading about his behavior in school, McDuff really comes across as your atypical juvenile delinquent. He was constantly disruptive in class. If he would fail a test or get in trouble, he made certain to let everyone else inside the classroom know about what it was that he had done. Students that knew McDuff said that he would oftentimes laugh maniacally before stopping suddenly and giving everyone a stare that would stop the rest of the class in their tracks. Almost as though, whatever it was that was inside of him could be seen in that stare and had frozen them all in place, sucking the joy from the room as well as the conversation from their lips. McDuff was a fairly big boy, but he was not the strongest of individuals. In grade school, he was something of a terror to other students up until 8th grade when he got into a fight with a young man who was fairly athletic, and this boy ended up beating McDuff fairly handily. And after this incident, McDuff turned to terrorizing the weaker kids in his school. There's conflicting reports on this. Some say that this happened in high school, others that it happened in 8th grade, some that he stopped bullying anyone in school after he got in the fight with this other student and lost, while others again still state that he continued terrorizing students, but he specifically chose the ones he knew were weaker than him. At any rate, McDuff eventually dropped out of school and went to work for his father doing concrete full-time. McDuff was pretty much a loner beyond his brother Lonnie, who would counsel his younger brother on the woes that Ken felt the world had heaped upon him. Somewhere in his mid-teens, McDuff, who I've already stated was a juvenile delinquent, really upped his ante as he began breaking into homes and businesses in the neighboring communities. Somewhere in this time frame, he confided in his brother that he had raped a woman and cut her throat, leaving her for dead. Now, Lonnie supposedly told his brother to go to bed and forget about it, which apparently McDuff did. At any rate, he was eventually arrested in 1964. McDuff was charged with 12 counts of burglary and 1 count of attempted burglary, and he ended up being convicted for all of this and was sentenced to 12 4-year prison sentences, each to be served concurrently. McDuff ended up being paroled in 1965, and because of this easy prison sentence, as well as the possibility that he may in fact have killed before going to prison, it has been said that he became remarkably different when he was released. He had been a bully before, but now he had almost a megalomaniac type persona about him, where he believed that he could do no wrong and that any wrongs that he may do would simply, fall to the wayside. All of this, coupled with his upbringing, where he was fawned upon by his mother and sisters, really built in McDuff's mind this idea that he was invincible. He also became much more sadistic after leaving prison. Part of this had to do with the fact that he attained the height of 6'3" and was well over 240 pounds. Now, this isn't 240 pounds of beer gut. He was, solid muscle. So you have to envision this guy in Central Texas who's basically the size of a professional wrestler or another, sports star, stalking the streets and basically doing whatever it was that he had wanted. McDuff was able to sucker, smaller, weaker guys into his orbit who acted like sidekicks to him. And one of these was Dale Greene, who was 2 years younger than McDuff and still lived at home with his mother. Now, Greene worked for McDuff's father, so it's easy to see how the two of them would become acquaintances. And according to Greene, he was mesmerized by the sadistic nature of McDuff and the tales that McDuff would spin to him. And at first he didn't believe them, but that soon changed as he got to know McDuff. And according to Greene, again, he was firmly convinced that McDuff was telling the truth when one night at Greene's mother's home, McDuff pinned a young woman to the floor in one of the home's bedrooms and squeezed a tube of deep heat, which is similar to, icy hot, just without the icy, into her vagina, and then refused to let her get up as she screamed, cried, and begged of the agony that it was causing her. McDuff confided to Greene that he had raped and murdered multiple women at this point, although, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of evidence to support any of this, beyond the fact of what McDuff would go on to eventually do. On August 6, 1966, which was a Saturday, McDuff and Greene, who had spent the day working for McDuff's father pouring concrete in Temple, Texas, decided to go out cruising for women. in McDuff's new car, which his mother had purchased for him, and they went to Fort Worth before eventually ending up in the small town of Everman, Texas, which is just outside of Fort Worth. And this was the crime that I was talking about in the trailer for the show. They drove around, they were in Everman, and McDuff spotted the three teens, 16-year-old Edna Sullivan, who was wearing a red and white striped blouse and what I've seen described of as cut-off jeans or Daisy Dukes, with two teenage boys. Her 17-year-old boyfriend, Robert Brand, and Robert's cousin, 15-year-old Mark Dunnman, who was visiting them from California. And upon approaching the car, McDuff first robbed the two boys of their wallets before demanding that they get inside the trunk. According to Greene, McDuff then said, "They gotta look at my face, I'll have to kill them." Greene later stated that he didn't fully believe what McDuff was saying, this despite having seen him commit horrific acts on other women. They drove through the back roads around Everman, getting onto the highway before pulling off into a field. At which point he pulled Edna Sullivan out of the trunk of the boys' car and had Greene lock her in the trunk of his own car. Greene stated that the boys were on their hands and knees in the trunk of the Ford, begging for their lives when McDuff shot them both point blank in the face. He further went on to say that a peaceful expression spread across McDuff's face before he began shooting again. He shot Brand twice and Dunnman 3 times. He then lifted Dunnman up by the hair and shot him in the face again. Now this is from the testimony of Roy Dale Greene. After this, McDuff attempted to close the trunk of the car, only to find that it would not shut. So he backed the car up to a fence and had Greene wipe it down for any fingerprints before the two of them drove off into the night. They ended up driving south, crossing the Johnson County line before pulling to the side of a road, roughly 11 miles away from where they had left the Ford. McDuff forced Edna from the car, made her undress, then threw her in the back seat and began to rape her. Now, he raped her at least twice before making Greene rape her, at which point McDuff raped her once again. And according to Greene, he only heard the girl speak once. Supposedly, she told McDuff that, "I think you ripped something," as McDuff raped her on the third time. He then drove to another location before turning down a gravel road, at which point he took Edna from the car and told her to sit down on the road. Remember, though, at this point, according to his own testimony, Greene was an unwilling participant, yet he still did as McDuff ordered. McDuff told him to give him something to strangle the girl with, and Greene handed him a belt, which McDuff tried to no avail. It was at this point that he went back to the car and retrieved a length of broken broomstick, which is where he got his moniker of the Broomstick Killer, and he pressed the broomstick down across Edna's throat, pressing her into the ground. And according to Greene, he mashed down hard. She started waving her arms and kicking her legs, and he told me, "Grab her legs." Greene held Edna Sullivan down while Kenneth McDuff crushed her larynx with the broomstick, taking her life. After this, he threw her body over a fence and headed home, stopping along the way to get rid of the boys' wallets and get rid of their own bloody underwear. Naturally, their underwear was bloody from the brutal rapes that they had perpetrated against Edna Sullivan. Now, McDuff may have gotten away with this, except for the fact that Roy Dale Greene apparently had a conscience. The next day, which was Sunday, he was hanging out with friends, driving around when news of the horrific killings came over the radio, and he began blurting out to the people in the car what exactly had happened and his participation in it. He ended up going to the police with his story about what had happened, and consequently McDuff was arrested for the murders. Addie McDuff, Kenneth's mother, hired her son a lawyer, and she and her daughters sat in the courtroom the entire trial. Apparently, McDuff took the stand in his own defense at this trial, as he claimed that he had nothing to do with the murders, instead shifting the blame solely to Roy Dale Greene. And from what I have read, he spoke directly to the jury at numerous points, claiming that the sheriff of Falls County had had it out for him for years and was trying to pin the murders on him. His mother even attempted to supply an alibi for McDuff, telling reporters at a recess during the trial that he had spent the entire evening with a nice girl from their church. Although she refused to name the young lady, as she claimed Kenneth wanted to spare her reputation, adding, "He's too good for his own good." Now, McDuff would end up receiving 3 death sentences for the murder, while Roy Dale Greene ended up getting 5 years for his participation in the murders. And from what I was able to find, upon his release, he basically spent his free time out at the family farm or in his sister's bar. And according to the sheriff, he was, quote-unquote, pretty messed up from all of it. And I can see that if you look at pictures of Roy Dale Greene, he seems like your typical teenager who literally got pulled into something that he wasn't prepared for. Now, McDuff came within days of being executed 3 times in 1969 and 1970. However, the case of Furman versus Georgia put an end to all of that, as Furman basically stated that the death penalty was unconstitutional, and this eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, who overturned the country's death penalty, basically telling the states that they had to come up with that each one had to come up with a death penalty that fell within the realms of the Constitution. Now, because of this, McDuff had his murder convictions transferred over to life sentences, and he was eventually sent to the Ramsey unit and assigned to work in the fields doing manual labor. McDuff's family, particularly his mother, however, never gave up on him. In 1977, she hired a new lawyer with the sole purpose of proving that her son was innocent and that Roy Dale Greene was, in fact, the real mastermind behind the slayings. One of the things that his new lawyer did was he sent basically a 26-page manifesto to the parole board with an updated version of the events of the murder. In the original version, McDuff had claimed that he had lent his car to Greene so that he could go on a date, and that while out on this supposed date, Greene had committed murders. He changed this to that he had lent the car to Greene after Greene had threatened him because Greene wanted to go pull a murder. The implication being here that Kenneth McDuff wanted nothing to do with breaking the law. And that while out in the car, Greene, who had met the teens earlier in the day, met up with them again, at which point he killed the two boys and then proceeded to rape and murder Edna. The long and the short of this is that one member of the parole board believed this new far-flung story, and I mean, it is really far-flung. McDuff claimed that Greene had gone out drinking with the teens and that they had run out of beer, at which point they left a Dodge in a field and went in the teens' car to go get more. He further went on to claim that they did get beer, and the spot where Edna Johnson's body was found is where they had gone to drink that beer, at which point he had proceeded to rape Edna before shooting the two boys and putting their bodies in the trunk, before going back to rape Edna again, and because he had fired all of his bullets, murder her with the broomstick. At which point Dale Greene had driven the Ford back to the field where he had left McDuff's car, parked it against the fence, wiped it down, and headed back to get McDuff, whom he had left at a burned-out building. As I said a few moments ago, one of the members of the board believed this crock of nonsense. But what they believed more was the new defense attorney's assertion that there was jury misconduct going on in the original trial in 1966. And this hint of jury misconduct stemmed from a newspaper article at the time of the original trial, in which it was claimed that one of the jurors, so disturbed by what they were hearing, had proceeded to carry a hip flask with them. Now, the story goes on that the jury, who were sequestered in a dorm, were visited by the local sheriff one night, who went and told the jurors about another crime he suspected McDuff to be involved in. This one was a rape and disfigurement. And supposedly the sheriff told the jurors that because of quote-unquote stupid laws, he was not allowed to bring this evidence up at trial. Supposedly, this story had been leaked to the media by a bailiff at the courthouse, who fled town not long after the trial had concluded out of fear of the sheriff retaliating against her. The long and short of it is that McDuff was eventually able to get an evidentiary hearing, and the judge rejected his claims of jury misconduct. But McDuff's story obviously wasn't finished there. As we know, he was a serial killer. McDuff ended up getting convicted again while he was in prison for attempting to bribe a prison official. This was a member of the parole board who he supposedly told that if he could get his vote, then he's out of here. His family, quote-unquote, has the money. This parole board member then went to the prison officials, informed them of this, and McDuff was tried and convicted of it. However, in 1987, the state of Texas's board, which oversaw prisons, decided that in order to avoid overcrowding, they needed to parole 750 individuals per week. This brings us to 1989, when, amazingly, Kenneth McDuff, who had already committed 3 known murders, was paroled by the state of Texas. And I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, how can this happen? Well, by that point, McDuff's crimes had long faded from memory, and he was really just a number sitting in prison on life. When the parole board looked at McDuff's files, they saw that he had been taking college credit courses, as well as had at least one affirmative vote for release. So because of this, he was released. And they had a chance to stop what was to come, as McDuff was nailed in 1990 on the charge of making a terroristic threat, which would have sent him back to prison for the remainder of his sentence. This stemmed from an incident where McDuff had verbally assaulted a group of black teenagers before chasing one of them down an alleyway with a knife and threatening him. And when McDuff went before the Parole Violations Board, his attorney had to scream at McDuff to be quiet as McDuff stood there ranting and raving about how much he hated blacks. And what happened next is that the charge against McDuff was dropped, thus allowing him to walk free. And once he was free, at least according to Sheriff Larry Pamplin, he knew that McDuff was going to kill again, and that he was on the prowl looking to do so once again. And from all accounts, McDuff stayed fairly clean at first, moving around quite a bit, staying close by to his older sisters or his mother. And it's been noted that he spent money freely at this point despite having no discernible method of income, drove new cars, and wore new clothing. What is known, however, is that he would rob drug dealers at every opportunity, which may explain how he was financing his newfound freedom. Now, unfortunately for the police, because he moved around so much, it was very hard for them to track the crimes that McDuff was committing, which is namely murder and robbery. In the spring of 1991, he enrolled at the Texas State Technical College in Waco and moved into a dormitory on the campus. What's interesting to note here is that a number of prostitutes from the local area began disappearing shortly after McDuff moved into the dorm. The first murder that is linked to McDuff during this period of time is that of Brenda Thompson. Now, there's a number of conflicting reports on this particular murder. In fact, it is mixed up with another murder of a young woman named Regina Moore, who was another victim of McDuff. Now, Brenda Thompson, who was also known to be a drug addict, not that justifies what was done to her, was picked up on the night of October 10th, 1991 by McDuff. He tied her up inside the cab of his truck before coming across a police checkpoint and he apparently sat there for a moment before saying to hell with it, at which point he floored it at police. And in a report later filed by the officers on the scene, he nearly hit 3 of them. The officers gave chase, only losing McDuff when he turned the lights of his truck off and drove backwards down one-way streets in order to avoid them. After this, McDuff drove out to a wooded area near U.S. Route 84, at which point he tortured, raped, and murdered Brenda Thompson. Her body would not be discovered and identified until 1998. McDuff was questioned a few days after this by police, but apparently nothing was done of it, because he killed again 5 days later on October 15th, 1991. And this, as I said, is the murder that is often confused with Brenda Thompson. He picked up a 17-year-old prostitute by the name of Regina Deanne Moore. And the two of them were witnessed having an argument at a motel in Waco. Not long after this, McDuff drove to a remote area near Texas State Highway 6, at which point he tied her arms and legs with stockings before brutally raping and then killing her. And she was not found until September 29th, 1998. It's also believed that McDuff killed another young woman at this period of time, 23-year-old Cynthia Renee Gonzalez, who was found dead near a creek bed running along County Route 313 on September 21st, 1991. Although this one is unable to be conclusively linked to McDuff. However, on the 29th of December, McDuff and an accomplice, Alva Hank Worley, murdered Colleen Reed. The two men drove to a car wash in Austin and kidnapped Reed in sight of other witnesses before driving away. Worley later admitted in April 1992 that he had raped Reed and tortured her with cigarettes. He claimed, however, that it was McDuff who actually committed the murder. His next known victim was Valencia Joshua, who was also a prostitute. She was last seen knocking on McDuff's door on February 24th, 1992. Joshua's body was discovered on March 15th on a golf course. She had been strangled to death. After this, McDuff struck again, killing Melissa Northrup, a 22-year-old store clerk from Waco. Now, Northrup was pregnant at the time of her murder, and McDuff also robbed the store of $250. McDuff was a suspect in this murder pretty quickly, as he had been seen in the vicinity of the store where Northrup worked. And according to a later statement from one of McDuff's school chums, McDuff had attempted to enlist him in robbing the store, although the young man turned down the offer. Northrup's body was found by a fisherman on April 26th. McDuff pretty much vanished immediately after Northrup's murder, and it was around this time that police caught wind of the fact that he was supposedly peddling drugs on the college campus. And because of that and their suspicions that he was involved with the murders, an arrest warrant was put out for McDuff. And the police went into, full-scale manhunt mode trying to apprehend him. In addition to the suspicion in the murders and the drug charges, McDuff was also alleged to be in possession of a firearm, which was enough to get the U.S. Marshal Services involved in searching for him. This was in early March, and during this period of time, law enforcement learned all about Kenneth McDuff's past. One thing that they discovered that they really weren't expecting to was that McDuff had a daughter, a young woman by the name of Teresa. And upon meeting with Teresa, they learned that she was only 21 years old when she learned of her father's true identity, and that she had gone to visit him while he was in prison, becoming fascinated with the man. Teresa went on to state that McDuff had tried to convince her to smuggle drugs in with him. She also stated that he had offered to take her to Las Vegas with him after his release in order that he could be her pimp, which shows you what Kenneth McDuff actually thought of other people, the fact that he wanted to pimp his own daughter out on the streets of Las Vegas. Another revelation brought forth by Teresa was the assertion that McDuff's family had paid a board member of the parole hearing $250,000 in order to secure McDuff's release. Now, Teresa had become so disgusted by the man she now knew to be her father that she actually moved out of the state of Texas in order to get away from him. And even though they were looking for McDuff, they were also trying to tie him in with more murders. One of these was the murder of Reed, because apparently, according to witness descriptions, there had been two men in the Trans Am that McDuff had been driving. The second of which was described as a dark-complexioned white male, possibly Hispanic. They eventually came across Alva Hank Worley, who was a 34-year-old concrete worker. The police began putting pressure on Worley, who lived with his 14-year-old daughter at a motel in Temple. And they did this for a number of weeks until Worley finally broke. When the police got him to envision that Colleen Reed was actually his own daughter, because Colleen Reed was only a few years older than Worley's daughter. And Worley, after panicking and apparently putting on quite a scene, began to spin a tale for the officers. And basically the gist of what he said was that he and McDuff had been cruising around when they saw Colleen Reed at the car wash in Austin washing her black Mazda. McDuff had parked his Thunderbird in the bay next door and gone around to where Colleen was washing her vehicle, and when he returned, he had the young woman by the throat, holding her up off the ground so that she was walking on tiptoes. And according to Worley, she said, "Please, not me, not me." After which, McDuff threw her in the back seat and placed Worley back there with her to control the woman. They'd driven for a little while, going outside of Austin before McDuff pulled over and changed places with Worley. At which point, McDuff stripped Colleen Reed naked and stubbed out a cigarette on her vagina before raping her brutally. All of this while Worley was driving. According to Worley, he was absolutely terrified at this point. McDuff made him change places with him, and that's when he saw that Reed's hands had been tied behind her back. Worley then stated that he forced Colleen Reed to perform oral sex on him before raping her. McDuff had then pulled off the interstate on that Texas Highway 317, close to where his parents lived. He had stopped on a narrow dirt road and raped Colleen Reed again. According to Worley, when Colleen Reed was able to finally stand, she put her head on Worley's shoulder and said to him, "Please don't let him hurt me anymore." At which point McDuff grabbed her by the scruff of the neck and shoved her into the trunk of the Thunderbird, slamming the lid down on her head. After which he dropped Worley off at his own home, stating that he was going to quote-unquote use her all up. Now, this statement was enough for the police to be able to release it to the public and get the story national attention. And it ended up being featured on the May 1st episode of America's Most Wanted. Garnered them 50 tips. One of these tips came from Kansas City, Missouri. McDuff was living in Kansas City, working as a garbage man under the name of Richard Fowler. When the episode aired, a co-worker of his named Gary Smithy saw it and noticed how similar McDuff was to his friend Richard. Smithy ended up talking with a fellow co-worker about this before contacting the Kansas City Police Department, who searched their database for Richard Fowler's name and discovered that he had been arrested a few weeks prior and fingerprinted for soliciting a prostitute. A fingerprint check was done, cross-referencing with those of Kenneth McDuff, and it was learned that McDuff was, in fact, Richard Fowler, and vice versa. On May 4th, 1992, a surveillance team of 6 officers arrested McDuff as he drove to the landfill where he worked. Most of the arresting officers involved in this arrest were U.S. Marshals. Interestingly, one of the arresting officers was Falls County Sheriff Larry Pamplin, whose father had arrested McDuff for his first series of murders back in 1966. McDuff was tried for the final murder which he is known to commit, and that was for Melissa Northrup, and he was convicted of this. During the sentencing hearing, one journalist by the name of Gary Cartwright expressed his feelings that he hoped that McDuff would be executed, stating, "If there has ever been a good argument for the death penalty, it's Kenneth McDuff." On February 18th, 1993, the jury opted to sentence Kenneth McDuff to death. McDuff did his normal hoopla trying to avoid being executed. Eventually, however, his execution date was set for 1998. Shortly before his execution, he told officers where they could find Colleen Reed's body. You remember, she was the one who had been kidnapped from the car wash in Austin. McDuff was executed on November 17, 1998, at the age of 52, by lethal injection. McDuff's last words were, "I'm ready to be released. Release me." That is it for the Deathcast this week and this season. Again, I will be back in a few weeks, possibly in early to mid-April with new episodes. I hope you have enjoyed both this episode and this first season. Again, you want to help support the show, please leave a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. Also, share it on social media. Do you want to keep up to date with all the happenings with the podcast? Again, you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just look for either Author Totten or Ian Totten Author. And check out the Patreon page because, as I said, I will be releasing Patreon exclusive content here in the next few weeks. That's probably mostly going to be in the form of exclusive episodes. Stories that I thought were really good and worth covering, but are not long enough to warrant an official episode. Till next time, stay safe and stay morbid.
Welcome to the Deathcast.